Thank you, everyone. And I have to start off with a major apology, as pointed out by one of our featured guests. I'm a historian and an archivist. I pride myself on accuracy and thoroughness and double checking. And I did not realize that I had Rachmaninoff misspelled on the slide. And there's like 30-some slides, and that heading is on every one of them. Stéphane thought he could go quickly and change it. I said, no, you're going to do it like on 40 different slides. So Rachmaninoff will be misspelled throughout my presentation, and for that I have to apologize. I'm sorry? Yeah, when you get the Russian and the English, it used to be a Rachmaninoff with a V instead of two Fs. But anyway, the theme for tonight's program, and indeed the theme for the Rachmaninoff Festival that the orchestra is holding next week, is Rachmaninoff's special relationship with the Philadelphia Orchestra, which is really unique. It was very close, very collaborative, based on mutual respect and affection, and so much collaborative work in developing pieces and premiering them. And we really think that this is a unique relationship in music history, a composer and an orchestra being so closely associated. You have examples like Leonard Bernstein in the New York Philharmonic, but Leonard Bernstein was the conductor and music director of the New York Philharmonic, so you would expect that relationship. But in terms of an independent composer and pianist and an orchestra, we think this is probably unique in the annals of, at least in American orchestras. So what I'm going to do is give you a very brief overview of Rachmaninoff's history with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and then I'm going to turn it over to our panel, who will discuss in a discussion kind of mode Rachmaninoff's music and his life and his work in Philadelphia. So very quickly, I'll try to get out of everybody's way here. This is a quick overview of Rachmaninoff's life up to the point that he first appeared in Philadelphia. So he's born in 1873 in Russia. He begins musical training at a very young age, shows a lot of promise. He's admitted to the Moscow Conservatory, this very prestigious conservatory in Russia. He's a star pupil. He graduates in 1892, all kinds of awards and special recognitions and honors. And he's a rising star in Russia as a pianist, a conductor, and a composer. In 1897, there is the premiere of his First Symphony, which is an unmitigated disaster. The merits of the piece aside, everybody agreed that the orchestra was very poorly rehearsed and performed very poorly. The conductor was really poor. Several accounts have it that the conductor was drunk at the performance. So it was just a disaster. And Rachmaninoff goes into a depression and really doesn't compose for another 3 years. He goes into, eventually convinced to go into therapy, and he goes into intensive therapy with a Russian doctor and emerges from this and begins to compose and concertize again. But Rachmaninoff, by his nature, was a very melancholy person. He was prone to depression, anxiety, self-doubt. So he was not a positive, sort of optimistic person by nature, and so this event really sort of affected him deeply. But eventually he got over it. And in 1902, he marries. He has a couple of daughters. From 1904 to 1906, he's the conductor of the Bolshoi Theater, which is a very prestigious post in Russia. He decides he doesn't want to continue with that. All throughout this period, he's kind of famous throughout Europe and Russia, and American promoters are eagerly trying to get him to do a tour of America. And he keeps putting it off. He doesn't want to go to America. He doesn't want to bother. And he keeps raising his price and making unreasonable demands. But finally, they make him an offer that's incredibly lucrative. And plus, his financial situation was such that he decides he will indeed tour America. So he leaves in October. He gets here in late October. And from November through January, he tours America. His first concert appearance in the United States was a piano recital at Smith College in Massachusetts. That was November 4th. 4 days later, he appears in Philadelphia for the first time at the Academy of Music, but not with the Philadelphia Orchestra, with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Arrangements had been made for him to do a kind of a mini tour of America, some of the major cities, with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. So his first appearance in Philadelphia was with the Boston Symphony with their conductor, Max Fiedler. And if you can see on the program there, the third thing down, he plays his second piano concerto, which is one of the great masterpieces of the Romantic piano literature. So that's his first appearance in Philadelphia. Then, about 2.5 weeks later, November 26th and 27th is his first appearance with the Philadelphia Orchestra. This is the program. Most of the documents you'll see tonight are from the orchestra's archives. Many are also from the Library of Congress, which has Rachmaninoff's papers. I spent several days down there doing research for this project. So the original plan, and the conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra at that time is Karl Pohlig. That's him in the middle. The original plan is for Pohlig to, it's an all-Russian program. Pohlig's going to conduct Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture and then hand the program over to Rachmaninoff, who will conduct Symphony No. 2, give 3 of his piano preludes, perform those, and then conduct Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain. However, after the programs are printed, Karl Pohlig decides to just make it an all Rachmaninoff program, and he decides to eliminate the Tchaikovsky piece at first. So it's all Rachmaninoff, that first appearance. And so it's his first appearance with the Philadelphia Orchestra. It's his first conducting appearance in America. It's the American premiere of his Second Symphony, and it's his first appearance in America where he's in that 3-part role of composer, conductor, and pianist. So this was his first appearance in Philadelphia in 1909. The press coverage is very positive. As I said, he's a rising star in Europe and now in America, so he gets a lot of positive press in the Philadelphia papers. A little aside, Rachmaninoff really wanted an automobile. And he said in a letter to his friend, this is several months before the American tour, I'd like to buy an automobile, which, yeah, this is 1909, so they're very new, right? I can't tell you how much I want one. I don't want to go to America, but then perhaps after America, I'll be able to buy myself that automobile. And he does, in fact, buy himself an automobile after he gets back. This is a picture of him at his country estate in Russia, and one of his great joys, he wrote about this in his letters, is touring around the Russian countryside in his automobile. That was one of the most pleasurable things for him. So he's back in Russia in early 1910. He gets back to Russia. He spends time in other parts of Europe as well, but he continues, he's composing and playing the piano and conducting. And then in 1917 comes the Russian Revolution. And this is really a cataclysmic event in Russia, very dangerous, tumultuous time. And he gets an offer from a promoter in Scandinavia to do a series of concerts. So he and his wife and 2 daughters leave Russia in late December of 1917 for these concerts. Little does he know at the time that he will never return to Russia, and he will spend the rest of his life yearning for, missing, wishing to return to his Russian homeland. So he was a sort of melancholy person by nature, but this obviously made him a very sad person in many ways. So he stays in Scandinavia for about a year, he and his family, and then in the fall of 1918 they move to America, and they settle in New York. And he eventually had an estate, a lakeside estate in Switzerland. He would spend time in Europe, but essentially America was his home, his chief residence for the rest of his life. This is his family's visa, which is in the Rachmaninoff papers and at the Library of Congress. So by this time, 1918, Leopold Stachowski has become the conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra. And Stachowski is a very innovative, creative, boundary-stretching individual, always exploring new technologies, new repertoire. He's a champion of modern music, a champion of living composers. So he strikes up a friendship and a collaborative relationship with Rachmaninoff, and they begin to collaborate. So the first appearance by Rachmaninoff in Philadelphia after his return to America is March of 1919, which is like 10 years from his first appearance. He plays his first piano concerto. And then about a year later, Stachowski gives an all Rachmaninoff concert. And it's the third piano concerto with Rachmaninoff performing, and Stachowski conducts the American premiere of Rachmaninoff's choral symphony, The Bells, which is based on a poem by Edgar Allan Poe. So this is the American premiere of that work. So they're collaborating a lot, and they forged this very close relationship. There's a lot of correspondence in Stachowski's papers and the Rachmaninoff papers, very affectionate, very warm correspondence, and some of it's about music, some of it's about family, so you can tell they're becoming close friends. And of course, Stachowski has this Polish, Slavic heritage, and that Russian music is his specialty, so he really loves Rachmaninoff. And so over the course of the next, 15, 20 years, they do a lot. They record together a lot. The Philadelphia Orchestra gives many world and US premieres of Rachmaninoff's pieces. Stachowski tells the story that Rachmaninoff would write a piece, a composition, and have it published. Stachowski would get the score and the orchestra parts, bring it to Philadelphia, and rehearse the piece. It hasn't been performed yet. He would invite Rachmaninoff to come and listen to the rehearsals. Rachmaninoff would come down, and as a result of the rehearsals, he would want to make all these changes, so that there's all these changes to the score, but the score had already been published, and Stachowski is lamenting the fact that the world, in many cases, the versions that are published that everybody's playing are not the final versions that Rachmaninoff really wanted. In the Philadelphia Orchestra archives are these original scores with Rachmaninoff's markings and changes that only exist in the Philadelphia Orchestra music library. So they were collaborating a lot in the compositional process as well. In 1936, Stachowski decides that he no longer wants to be the full-time music director of the Philadelphia Orchestra. He declines a new contract, and he begins to sort of divorce himself from the orchestra. Eugene Ormandy, who was conductor of the Minneapolis Symphony, but had guest conducted very frequently in Philadelphia, is appointed the conductor. For a while, they're co-conductors, but over 5 years, Stachowski gradually lessens his time in Philadelphia, and after 1941, he's basically gone for good. But prior to that, Eugene Ormandy had been named music director, and it was really Ormandy's orchestra from the late 1930s on. And Ormandy and Rachmaninoff continue the close relationship. Rachmaninoff had performed with Ormandy in Minneapolis. He was assigned photo from Rachmaninoff to Ormandy in appreciation of his excellent rendering of my symphony. That's 1932, so this is years before Ormandy was appointed the conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra. So they continue the close relationship that Rachmaninoff had with Stachowski's, and they give Philadelphia Orchestra gives the world premiere of Rachmaninoff's Symphonic Dances in 1941. And then in 1948, now this is 5 years after Rachmaninoff's death, the Philadelphia Orchestra gives the first American premiere or performance of that First Symphony that was such a disaster, like 50 years ago. What had happened was when Rachmaninoff left Russia in 1917, he didn't bring the score with him, and the original score was lost. And he did make a piano transcription of it, and then in the early 40s or mid-40s, the orchestral parts were discovered in an archives, all the individual instrumental parts, and so from that and the piano score, they reconstructed the First Symphony. And the Philadelphia Orchestra gave the first performance of that symphony in 50 years since its disastrous premiere. The other interesting thing is that performance in 1948 was part of the very first TV broadcast by an orchestra. The Philadelphia Orchestra gave the first ever American TV broadcast of a symphony concert. They beat the New York Philharmonic by like an hour. I forget the exact time, but New York Philharmonic had a TV broadcast scheduled for like 7 o'clock, and Philadelphia went on at like 6 o'clock or something like that. Toscanini was always chiding Ormandy, you know, you beat us by an hour. But that very first TV broadcast in history included the reconstructed Rachmaninoff First Symphony. So, the culmination of Rachmaninoff's collaboration with the Philadelphia Orchestra is the 1939 cycle. So this is a series of 3 consecutive concerts, 3 consecutive Sunday nights in Carnegie Hall in New York City, November through into early December 1939. They're all Rachmaninoff concerts. Rachmaninoff is featured as a pianist, as a conductor, or just as a special guest with Ormandy conducting his works. I don't know if you can see it at the top of the program there. It says it's billed as one of the outstanding musical events of all time. So at the same time this cycle is happening, these 3 consecutive Sunday nights in New York, there are a series of 5 concerts in Philadelphia, basically the same repertoire. All Rachmaninoff. Rachmaninoff is conducting, performing, or as a special guest. So for these 3 weeks in late 1939, it's like all Rachmaninoff. And this is really the culmination of his special relationship with the Philadelphia Orchestra. On the left are the programs for the 3 Sunday night concerts in Carnegie Hall. On the right is one of the programs for the set of concerts in Philadelphia at that same time. There's a lot of positive press coverage of this. Now, Rachmaninoff is kind of viewed with mixed emotions by the music critics. He's sort of a traditionalist in that romantic tradition. He's not breaking new ground. You know, there's people like Debussy and Stravinsky that are modernists, they're doing all these innovative things. And Rachmaninoff was really old school. He's coming out of that Tchaikovsky tradition. So for a lot of critics, he was kind of old-fashioned, and he wasn't much in favor, although he was a master. Everybody acknowledged he was a great composer, he was a great pianist, but a lot of people were thinking he wasn't really in the vanguard of musical developments. But he was beloved by a lot of people, and a lot of critics did love him. I love this caricature of him in the, so this is all coverage of the 1939 cycle. What's really interesting is the Philadelphia Orchestra has a treasure trove of photos, of behind-the-scenes photos from this period. There was a cellist in the orchestra named Adrian Siegel, who was a photographer, an avid photographer. He kept his camera with him all the time. So he took thousands of photos, behind-the-scenes photos, in rehearsal, candid photos, in moments of relaxation or whatever. So in the orchestra archives are these thousands of photos behind the scenes of all the different artists that have played with the orchestra. And Adrian Siegel eventually published a book called Concerto for Camera, which is all his photos. But there are a number of photos of the rehearsal period around that 1939 cycle, like these and these of, you know, Rachmaninoff and Ormandy and the orchestra all collaborating. So we have a sort of treasure trove of these. And I will say that I'll talk about that in a minute. Wrapping up, so after the 1939 cycle, Rachmaninoff basically has about 3.5 years to live. And he performed 6 more times with the orchestra. The last performance in Philadelphia is in October of 1941. His last appearance with the orchestra, they did a little mini tour of the Midwest. He appeared with them in May of 1942 in Ann Arbor, Michigan. That was his last appearance. By this time, he's very ill. He's got cancer. On doctor's recommendation, he moves to a better climate. His family moved to Beverly Hills. A few years prior to this, he had basically given up any hope of ever returning to Russia, and he applied for U.S. citizenship. So he was granted citizenship on February 1st, 1943, and basically 2 months later, he was dead, a few days short of his 70th birthday. So that is just some historical context, a brief overview of Rachmaninoff's time and relationship in Philadelphia. I'm going to turn it over now to our esteemed panel who will discuss Rachmaninoff's music and his life. So moderating the discussion is Jeremy Rothman, who is the Vice President for Artistic Planning for the Philadelphia Orchestra, and Principal Guest Conductor Stéphane Denève. Stéphane is directing the festival, and it basically was his idea, right? Stéphane initiated this whole idea of the festival next week, and is conducting it. And then Professor David Cannata is a professor of music at Temple University and a Rachmaninoff scholar who's written a lot about Rachmaninoff. He's one of the acknowledged scholars on Rachmaninoff. So they will discuss Rachmaninoff's life and... Somebody's cracking there. We need to change the chairs too because he can't sit on. We need to put the other chairs. Can't use this stool.
We just have to push it.
But I did want to give a plug. I think are the festival concerts all sold out?
I think it's on.
Almost sold out. So there are 3 performances, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, next week. Not this week, but next week. They're almost sold out, and it's all Rachmaninoff. And there's a lot of interesting activities. That's me or you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Prior to each of the 3 concerts, the orchestra has commissioned a playwright. Is Dee Dee here? No. Is she? Okay. Dee Dee Bauer is a playwright and director. The orchestra commissioned her to write a series of short plays about Rachmaninoff and his relationship with the Philadelphia Orchestra. So one of the plays will be performed prior to each of the concerts next week. And then along with the, after the concerts will be a lot of post-concert activities, salons and activities, and maybe Jeremy can speak more about that. I am curating an exhibit of a lot of the documents that you saw will be on display at the Kimmel Center. So it's really going to be a varied, sort of action-packed Rachmaninoff festival next week. So if you haven't got tickets yet, I would urge you to hurry up. So with that, Jeremy Rothman, Stéphane Denève, and David Cannata. And apologies once again for the misspelling. I can't believe that was such an egregious error.
Non è prima, non ultima.
No.
Not the first.
And won't be well, coming from you, I feel...
I live in terror every time I write that man's name.
Well, if that's your situation, then I don't feel so bad.
Oh. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening. You can hear us okay? Maybe?
I don't know.
How about that? Okay.
Thank you all for being here. Jack, thank you for this wonderful presentation and for all of your education that you've provided us, all the great information that we've been able to build this festival around. As Jack was mentioning, April 27, 29 of next week, all at 8 o'clock. Well, really starting at 6 and 6:30 in the evening. We have this great festival presentation where we're going to hear all 4 of his piano concerti. We're going to hear the symphonic dances. We're going to hear the Paganini variations. Stéphane is leading all of this with 2 great pianists, Nikolai Lugansky and Hao Chen Zhang, 2 very different pianists performing all this repertoire. And as Jack mentioned, we're going to bring this story to life pre-concert. Rather than having lectures, as much as we love lectures, we're going to have these dramatic presentations, about 45 minutes each. So as Jack talked about when Rachmaninoff went and got some psychotherapy to break his writer's block, we'll have some actors on stage depicting that dialogue, depicting Rachmaninoff's relationship to Ormandy, relationship to some key people in Philadelphia, his reflections on his life in Russia and his journeys around America. So these are really great presentations with a cast of actors that are going to happen on stage with a lot of these visuals as well. We then have the concerts themselves that Stéphane is going to lead and guide us through with some special surprises, then some salon chamber music afterwards that are going to link to the story of the whole the whole evening, as Jack mentioned. Also, we're going to have these displays out in the lobby, some interactive moments, so some Russian food and beverage. So it's a really festive kind of environment. And indeed, this was Stéphane's great idea. It has been made possible through very generous support of Tatiana Copeland, who has become a friend of the orchestra, lives down in Wilmington, Delaware, and happens to be the grandniece of Sergei Rachmaninoff. So she, having had this sort of family lore, has contributed a great deal of knowledge and spirit to this festival as well. Stéphane, your dream to have this festival here in Philadelphia started a couple of years ago, and you wanted this to be a destination, sort of a Bible,
Mecca, yes.
a Mecca for Rachmaninoff.
Well, the fact is, it is so unique, this relationship, as you said, Jack. There's no relationship like Rachmaninoff and this orchestra indeed. And I truly believe in the soul of an orchestra. You know, an orchestra is a group of people that actually change very slowly over the years. You know, the turnover of personnel is extremely slow. For your historical information, since 104 years, so more than a century, the Philadelphia Orchestra has had 3 principal oboe. Only 3. And just to tell you that, of course, what has been done in the years of Stachowski, for instance, how he molded the sound of the orchestra, actually is still here today, because every new member since more than a century now has been entering the orchestra within a sound and has been himself or herself molded as well by the style. And so I'm very privileged to make music with this amazing orchestra and to realize that they are good for, of course, so many repertoires, but for that repertoire, which is this composer, they just have indeed a sound which I enjoy so much, conducting some concertos with them. And so, indeed, I said to Jeremy and Alison Vulgamo, the chief executive, the president of the orchestra, I said, look, we need to do something more than just playing regularly Rachmaninoff music during the season, and I would love to do a very special festival, and this is, I hope, the first of more, because indeed, this orchestra deserves to be the Bayreuth, indeed, like for Wagner, you know, the special place where the music lover of Rachmaninoff would come to hear really the style as it should be.
So we can dig more into the sort of the characteristics of Rachmaninoff's sound, and when you're working with his orchestra, what you're sort of looking for and shaping. But maybe you could give us some insight into the personality of this great man and how that maybe informs the music that we hear performed. Or were there some characteristics and traits of him personally that were particularly prominent?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and it could keep us going for a long time. However, I think I was about the age of 12 when I thought, how on earth could someone write music that is this beautiful? So I thought, well, that's one thing I should find out. So there I found myself in the former Soviet Union, in the early 90s. It was still the Soviet Union there. And I was the first one to go through systematically his collection of manuscripts that were left behind. I had already done the same thing at the Library of Congress, and you probably used my catalog, Jack. Yes, that manuscript 1A, manuscript 1B, that's my catalog. Sure enough, I found out how he went about composing such music, and you alluded to it, that he was one of the foremost students of then a very fledgling Russian music education system. The other one in the class that he had was Scriabin, who ended up really in a state of self-destruction after a little while, but Rachmaninoff was really doing quite well until the First Symphony came about, and it was Mrs. Rachmaninoff who thought Glazunov was drunk. Yes, the parts still exist. I've seen them at the St. Petersburg Conservatory Library. He did have corrections that were made, But I think the disastrous premiere, imagine if it was your novel that had gone badly and was badly received. His First Symphony, it really cut him back as if he said he was like a man who had had a stroke and could barely speak. He never really recovered from it. He was at the Bolshoi Theatre for 2 years, and if you can imagine, 1906, and there was Altani, who was the conductor of Italian opera, who had agoraphobia, and he conducted with old clothes all around him, and all you could see out of his little place were his arms, and he was hard up against the stage, so the orchestra, in the pre-Wagnerian manner, were right behind him. Well, Rachmaninoff wasn't going to have any of this at all. He stood back with the orchestra in front of him, and he was in charge of Russian opera and the stage behind the orchestra. So during those 2 years, the orchestra, the conductor's podium moved backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. So in some ways, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. And that was when he was in charge of the music, whether he was in charge of the composition or the performance. And that performance in Northampton, Massachusetts, was his first performance on the solo stage as a pianist performing full-time for money. And that was the 3rd of November, 1904. It was supposed to be the 3rd, but the boat came in late. The 4th of November, 1909. If he was in sole command of what was going on, whether he was at the keyboard or at the manuscript paper, he was okay. Conducting, he didn't like so much because he had to deal with those things called orchestral people who managed the institution. He didn't like dealing with that sort of thing. And that's why he didn't take the Boston Symphony Orchestra after 3 invitations. He was very jovial with his family and with his friends, and the recordings of the parties that went on after the New York concerts are full of fun and frolics, especially when his daughter Irina, the Countess Volkonsky, is trying to get him to accompany her. And it's very funny. He pretends he cannot keep up.
You spoke about this legacy of the orchestra, and as recently as a couple of years ago, we had a musician in the orchestra who had played one of these final concerts with Rachmaninoff and had a very personal interaction that he described as being not quite so pleasant. So Stéphane, coming back to your point of this lineage of the orchestra, what you pick up on.
What I would like to say, which is interesting, is in his first visit in 1909, indeed, strangely enough, his first concert in Philadelphia was with the Boston Symphony, and I learned that it was quite regular that the Philadelphia Orchestra would play in different cities and quite traveling a lot around, and the same for the Boston Symphony or New York. I mean, those orchestras were moving more than they do now, actually, in the region. But later on, Rachmaninoff said that in 1909, the best orchestra was not the Philadelphia Orchestra. He said at that time, the Boston Symphony was the best. And in fact, that makes a proof that what is happening, I don't want to play for my team, but is that Rachmaninoff really felt a special connection with Stachowski and what Stachowski did on the Philadelphia Orchestra. I mean, Karl Polish, indeed the music director of the Philadelphia Orchestra before 1912, was only a good conductor, I'm sure, but it's definitely with Stachowski that the Philadelphia Orchestra became so famous. And indeed, that in the next visits, that something really happened with the orchestra and Rachmaninoff, and that they started even to record together, which was a very early process. So I think it's interesting to say that the style of Stachowski was pleasing Rachmaninoff. There is even an interesting anecdote, which is that Ormandy, so at the end of the 30s, was becoming indeed the music director, and he said he sent a letter to Rachmaninoff saying that he would be so honored if he could do the world premiere of the Third Symphony that he knew was written. And Rachmaninoff answered and said, of course, I would like the Philadelphia Orchestra, the best of the best, my favorite orchestra, to premiere the Third Symphony, and in fact, all the last 5 best pieces, I mean, the only big pieces he wrote for orchestra after leaving Russia were premiered by the Philadelphia Orchestra. And he said to Ormandy, my agent, Charles Foley, organized already this possibility, and I certainly informed Stachowski, but you may want to adjust that with him because he may have promised already to Stachowski, I don't know. Actually, I think, compare some letters, that he was lying. He knew that it was already promised. He was just a bit delicate and wanted to give the problem to Ormandy and Stachowski himself, but actually it was already promised to Stachowski, and Stachowski not being, actually I did premiere the symphony, indeed, the Third Symphony. So there was a big connection between Stachowski and Rachmaninoff. It seemed as well that sometimes they would disagree. Stachowski was a difficult man as well, has his own idea about tempos, and apparently some moment of the recording of the second piano concerto, they recorded it twice. And there is a fantastic story as well that the very first recording in 1924, which was acoustic and with a smaller version of the orchestra, because it was really, the little, we call that pavilion, I mean, to record very, very near. So it was not even a grand piano, it was half a grand piano, and a very small orchestra with no double basses, and they actually recorded, and they didn't issue the first movement.
They did not issue the first movement.
Because he was not happy with it, and so usually sometimes they still have some issue.
They did not.
One of the things you'll be able to see on display this week and next week is the score from the Isle of the Dead,
huge Pandora's box.
Okay.
You don't want to open that. You don't want to open that.
But I will say one of the things that you'll see there is that the first 4 bars of the score are crossed out.
You don't want to open that box. You don't want to open that box.
He was tinkering with these things.
Oh God! No.
Constantly, and his hand.
Temple timeout. Temple timeout. There's only one word I had that I wanted to address with you, Jack, and that was your addition. That was your word of versions. When does a version become a version? He was very sure when a version was a version because it's when he published it. Now, the Isle of the Dead, with the so-called revision by excision, you never, ever do them. Because you'll then end up by doing all those lovely excisions from the Third Concerto, and you're not going to do them, are you, Maestro? No. Without any evidence, he just says no. And you wouldn't do them for the Isle of the Dead, you wouldn't do them for the Third Symphony, you wouldn't do them for the symphonic dances, so why did he put them in there? He was desperate that he should like to get some more performances and didn't want his audiences to be bored. Well, you weren't bored here in Philadelphia, thank goodness. But there were other places where they were bored. New York. And in fact, the New York Philharmonic's premiere of the Second Concerto, a piece composed in 1900, the New York Philharmonic's premiere of the Second Concerto was 1927. Never, ever re-evaluate a Rachmaninoff score the way he did. He was re-evaluating it as a performer and not as a composer. That's where it all comes into play, doesn't it? He wondered if he chased 3 hares and caught none of them. And I once was telling his grandson this, and his grandson said, well, what would you say to my grandfather if he was standing right beside me? I'd tell him to grow up, realize that his music is stupendously beautiful and skillfully crafted. Do you know that? Yes, you do know. The Second Symphony, slow movement. There's a part where the theme comes back and the flute, 2 or 3 measures beforehand, has a prefiguration of the theme. And he decides to chop that out too. He just hacked away at the music.
I have to say, I wish Rachmaninoff could be here today and could notice how much he won posterity, because he's one, officially actually, of the most played composer today. I think the list, there is like Beethoven, Mozart, and he comes fourth, so he's one of the most played composers. He's universally loved and respected, but this is new. We have to remember that it is new, that indeed he suffered all his life from quite a number of bad critics, as you said, that the reviewer were, and he suffered, he was reading them, and he was writing in letters often that he was really sad by the reviews. And indeed, what is sad is that he accepted to some cuts. In some pieces, he revised some concertos, like his fourth concerto, and
That's different. That's different. They came out published. They came out as published editions. This is the 27 version, this is the 28 version, this is the
But let's say that
1940
he was indeed making some cuts in his pieces, and it is complicated because he was worried that the piece would be sometimes too long, and when he did the fourth piano concerto, he made a letter where he said, "Oh my God," to a friend of his, Metner, he said, "It's already 110 pages, and this is just too long," and he wanted to already cut. But the fact is, his music indeed doesn't deserve to be cut as much as it has been by performers, and sometimes by himself, indeed.
and sometimes by himself. But there's a further wrinkle, and that is, not only was it that he composed the pieces and he would publish them and sometimes reissue them, but he also recorded them. And you mentioned the 1939, you have to say 1939, 1940, I'll get back to that in a minute, but in April of 1929, he was across in Camden, New Jersey, recording his so-called second reading for the Isle of the Dead, which, it's a spectacular piece of music, until he decided to chop bits out of it. And then it really sounds like a hack job. A hack job. The transitions are not smooth, cuts out half the things that are beautiful. But the interesting thing about the 1939-40 Rachmaninoff cycle was that when they recorded the third concerto with Ormandy conducting, there were parts between the soloist and the orchestra that were so disjunct that they could not publish them. So they had to recall the Philadelphia Orchestra back to Carnegie Hall, where the recordings had been made, so that the acoustic wouldn't change, and at great expense to the orchestra, they had to re-record parts of the third concerto. I heard some of the first takes of the third concerto, and really, you'd be surprised that it was Rocky playing. Really poor. But he was already sick by that stage. He was already 67 years old. He knew he had melanoma. He knew he had to get things out fast. And Ormandy and the orchestra, well, they came through for him, just as he always came through for them.
And he spoke about how he enjoyed recording with this orchestra more than any other orchestra because of that sort of flexibility.
Except for one, Mengelberg, Willem Mengelberg, the great Dutch conductor. Mm-hmm. His comment about Mengelberg was, "Oh, can that man accompany?" So I've got a quick question for the audience. No one's old enough to have heard Rocky play. No. I could have asked that question in New York, and have asked that question in New York, and I do get people who remember hearing him play. George Pearl, Milton Babbitt.
But he recorded only with the Philadelphia Orchestra, as a conductor.
Yes.
That's the only orchestra you need to hear the Third Symphony, the Isle of Dead, and the Vocalise, because this is the only recording we have of Rachmaninoff as a conductor, and it is indeed with the Philadelphia Orchestra.
But you need to lament the fact that these pieces have been cut.
And the fact is, it's very impressive indeed to see the quality of the playing of the orchestra.
And the finesse of the directorial control. Now I've got to ask you a question.
Even we are conductor, no question.
What's the most difficult moment in the Rachmaninoff to conduct?
Everything.
No, it's not. No, it's not.
If you want to do well, it's everything.
No, it's not.
I don't know. You tell me.
No, you should know. Is the second concerto easier than the third?
Which piece you mean?
Any piece. What are the difficult moments in Rachmaninoff to conduct?
Well, there are a lot of transitions of tempo that are...
You have that in Mahler too. Fine. Is the second concerto more difficult than the third?
I think that's a strange question, because for me, everything is difficult, depends only the standard that you aim for. So I don't feel anything is easy.
There's much more that's demanding of the conductor in the second concerto than in the third. The third, it's all on the solos. The orchestra has some difficult moments. This is the moment where Mahler wanted to rebow the passage, just in the transition. But the fugue in the second concerto. There are parts in the last movement of the second concerto. Very nasty.
What about a soloist? You just stick to conducting, right? You don't try to play them. You're an excellent pianist.
I did study a little bit the concertos, and they're all extraordinarily difficult, though they're all very, very well written for the instrument. So it's actually despite the size of Rachmaninoff's hand, which was very big, I think actually you can really play everything, even if you have a small hand, or a smaller hand than Rachmaninoff.
No, the smaller hands can play Chopin. No, even he, with the large stretches, would arpeggiate things that he could actually stretch.
Indeed, like the beginning of the second concerto.
Beginning of the second concerto, you can play that all.
The third, for pianists, usually the third piano concerto is considered, the Everest of, because it's very long and it's ultra virtuosic, but it's extremely rewarding to Rachmaninoff, though, because I have to think that's a very personal story. Whoa, is it me? Is it you? It's a very personal story, but I have to thank Rachmaninoff for having a new piano when I was a new piano, because I did study the second piano concerto when I was 13, something like that, and I played it to my mother, who then, I think that's the only concerto that makes your mother believe you're a genius. So she was so impressed, that actually I could make the case that I really needed not an upright piano, but a grand piano. And my parents actually took a big loan to offer me a Yamaha baby grand. And it's really, I'm not joking, it's thanks to the second piano concerto of Rachmaninoff. That's how I convinced my parents to buy a piano.
That's very funny.
So thank you, Sergei Vasilyevich.
So we've thrown a question out to you. Do you have questions for our panelists here? Yes, go ahead.
So how do you know if you're getting the cut versions or the uncut versions when you buy a CD or a record?
Very good question.
You could do it by length alone. For a piece like the Second Symphony. Unfortunately, as glorious as the Ormandy recording is of the Second Symphony with the Philadelphia Orchestra, it's cut.
Did that have to do with the length of the records to make it fit?
Well, people have argued that, but Rocky had the profile to say, don't you cut a thing. And they would have said, fine, we won't.
No, it was possible. There have been very early full opera recordings. If they wanted, they could issue recordings with the full thing. It is interesting because even now, I mean, tempos are slowing down, and so yes, when you look at the timing of recording, you could sometimes feel that it is cut, but depends, because these days people conduct often slower than it was in the time of Rachmaninoff. And what is fantastic, if you listen to Rachmaninoff recordings themselves, is that they are very lively and they are much more fluid than we hear usually. And I do believe that it is very important as well to maintain a tradition of fluidity in Rachmaninoff.
If you're looking at your CD sleeve, it should say Toten Insel 1929 reading. Then you'll know you've got the cut version. And he actually promoted this version to people like Kusevitsky and Gavrilovich.
He writes on the top of the score, these are my cuts, and you must follow them, Sergei Rachmaninoff.
1941.
So come see it in the lobby of the Kimmel Center.
But don't do them.
We have another question back here.
Sure. If you could treat these as two questions, I'd appreciate it. Why did he cut, and why did he cut so badly?
Why did
he cut the pieces, and why did he make such bad cuts?
No, why did he cut so badly?
Yeah, I mean, you've been saying that the cuts are disastrous. I'm curious as to why he cut in the first place, as one question, and then why did he cut so badly as a second question?
He cut because he thought he would get more performances with shorter works. Someone should have introduced him to the works of Mahler or Bruckner or Rosenkavalier or Goethe Demrom or something. Why did he cut so badly? Well, if you've got a piece that's beautifully streamlined already, and the transition from point A to point B is just so glorious, you cut out even 2 or 3 measures, it's going to sound like a hiccup.
At the very end of our season, Yannick, our music director, is leading Mahler's 3rd Symphony. It's 100 minutes of fantastic music all the way through. So that's balancing out the lengths of works that were also being written around that time.
Yeah, you could get it. It's like the second act of Valkyra. You know, when Fricker comes on, you can trim away a good 15 minutes. Would anyone do that? No, not in sacred Wagner. You know?
We have one last
Oh, laugh. That was funny.
No, I was just thinking, because I don't want I mean, bad cuts. What do we mean with bad cuts? I mean, if you like Rachmaninoff music, you can argue that any cut is bad. Now, let's be honest. I mean, the cuts that he sometimes proposed, or the cuts that have been made, a lot of them do make sense, and you can still even discuss in the 2nd Symphony, which is a very long work. I think some cuts could be reasonably discussed, and I don't want to be, like more, purist than the composer himself. So let's not go too far as well as saying that he was doing something ridiculous. It was indeed a different context. I think the most important point here is to remember that he was suffering a world that wasn't considering him as old school and not modern enough, and he was really worried very much. He wrote about the new music, the modern music, as being something that he doesn't believe in, that for him was not having enough heart, and he was desperate, and that's why, indeed, he may have thought that some pieces that were not played so often maybe could be more played if they were a little bit trimmed, but there's nothing, of course, ridiculous. It's really just sad that he was thinking that, and that he was not confident enough. But he was indeed not very confident anyway. I mean, he was a little bit...
But whenever he had the chance to reinsert a passage that had been excised, he always took the opportunity. So, for example, in the first concerto, that pesky first subject in the 3rd movement, that very few pianists can play, it was there, and then he took it out, and then he put it back in, and then he took it out, and he put it back in. And he took it out finally and put it back in finally. It's about 4 or 5 different readings for that piece. He always puts the cut material back in.
So we're nearing the end of our time. I saw we had two more questions
Oh,
here.
yes, sorry.
So we'll start, and we'll come to you next. Yes, go ahead.
How was the second performance of the First Symphony received?
That's a very good question. I don't know how that performance in 1948 was. I mean, people were certainly still very shocked by the death of Rachmaninoff. It was only a few years after, 5 years after. And what was the reception here? Do you know?
The reception in Holy Mother Russia, or the Soviet Union as it was at the time, was a masterpiece. Now, the first and last movements are really very good. The second and third movements are a bit disappointing compared with everything else in his oeuvre. For here, it was interesting.
But he never entered the repertoire. Let's be honest. The First Symphony never became.
Do you conduct it, Maestro?
No, I don't conduct it.
And it was not performed again in Philadelphia until about 1991.
Oh, really?
There was quite a gap from that. That was the New York premiere as well during that time, and it was not performed in New
But there was
York.
one small.
Very rare, much less performed.
One thing which is touching me so much is that, so remember that it was premiered in 1897 and then was put to rest during the entire life of Rachmaninoff.
Oh, yes, I know.
And there is something so touching is that at the end of the first movement of the last piece that he wrote for orchestra, the symphonic dances, there is, if you listen that, the last 1.5 minutes of the first movement of the symphonic dances, please listen to it if you don't know it because it's extremely touching. Suddenly, there is one beautiful theme melody in the string that arrives and that comes for the first time and will not be developed, will not come back. And when this piece was premiered in Philadelphia, nobody knew that this melody was actually a quote of that first symphony that was actually not existing, basically.
And you know why he did it?
Tell me.
Because the recapitulation of the First Symphony is one strophe less, and that's where it occurs. The interesting thing about the First Symphony also was it was premiered on the 28th of March. Is that what you said? Something like that. He died on that same day in 1943.
So the touching thing is that he made peace secretly, and he was very secretive for sure. He was making peace with the biggest failure of his musical career in quoting himself at the end of Symphony Dances in what became his last piece ever. So it's of course very romantic because at the time he didn't know it was his last piece. I mean, but he could maybe.
Well, it wasn't his last piece, it was his last orchestral piece.
Or there was a tiny piece for piano. Yeah.
No, there were other pieces as well and recordings. But we'll talk about that later. Interestingly, in the symphonic dances, he records not only his life story, but that of the 19th century. And I'm often reminded of that line from Hamlet, within the book and volume of my brain. And that's also, the passage you mentioned is also a Mendelssohn quote. And there's Richard Strauss quotes, there are Liszt quotes, there are Schubert quotes, right through back through the 19th century. It's almost as if you have your own pictures at his own exhibition. It's really quite an extraordinary retrospective.
So our final question right here. Yes.
The professor said he started to study Rachmaninoff because he wanted to know more about this incredibly beautiful music.
Yes.
Okay, I listened to it, and I can't believe how beautiful it is. It's almost painful. And I'm asking Conductor Denève, I mean, how can you almost stand up something so beautiful? I mean, it's so incredible. I mean, doesn't it overwhelm you?
It's a very interesting question, actually, how you deal with emotion when you conduct. And the fact is, you are still leading and you still have to actually be lucid. You have this word in English?
Lucid.
Lucid, you know.
Lucid,
and it's very dangerous sometimes because you're very tempted to let it go and only be the first listener of the orchestra. And I think it's important. And when I conduct, actually, I really enjoy the sound produced, especially here in Philadelphia, it's one of the most beautiful, lush, sostenuto sound of an orchestra you can dream of. And that's why Rachmaninoff loved it, and it's still there. And indeed, sometimes actually I have to refrain myself to not have tears and to not embarrass myself in front of the orchestra, because indeed you deal with emotion. So it is a struggle. Sometimes I have to say you really have to try to keep in control, and like when you are watching a movie, and you're in a plane and you don't want to cry in front of the plane, you have to swallow, you have to find anything you can. But it is with Rachmaninoff it's difficult, because I agree with you, it brings a lot of very, very, his music is extremely emotional, and one of the most touching music you can imagine it is. So, yeah, you have to try.
And his music sparks great passion and great debate, as we can all sense. And we hope that you get a chance to hear Stéphane with the orchestra playing this incredible repertoire. You get to hear some of that history and legacy still on the sound today. We want to thank the Historical Society for hosting us here, Jack, for your great preparation.